This is the first in a three-part series. Karen actually did a pretty good job of explaining why some of the Badgers are doing this, so I'm going to link to her video. But the gist of it is I've been asked to explain why I am not a feminist. And to be honest, that part was my idea. The rest of the series was Allison's idea. And so without further ado, here goes. My first reason for being non-feminist, the first one that ever occurred to me in my life, was that I never had a reason to be feminist. All of the female role models with whom I grew up were non-feminist. Now, I'm not talking about shrinking violets that lived under some oppressive system and just took it either. I'm talking about women who, when they saw things that needed done, they stepped forward to do them. And none of them made any of their work about their sex. They simply did what needed to be done. My primary example, of course, is my mother. Her activism had a big impact on my community, starting with little things like getting the park fixed up that was down the street from my house, to bigger and bigger initiatives. She ran for city council. She eventually became city councilman at large, and for a while she was president of the city council in the community where I grew up. I went with her when she was an ambassador to our sister city in Japan, and I also saw her through some pretty big controversies for a little town. I watched her engage in environmental activism, and I watched her engage in religious activism. But never once did I watch my mother define herself around victimhood. I never saw her describe being female as a condition of being oppressed. My mom and my other female role models were guided by their compassion for their fellow human beings and by their beliefs. None of them ever said to me that they were guided in their activism by feminism. I never had anybody turn to me and say, in order to do what I've done in my life, you need to be a feminist. So I really never had any reason to identify as one. I never had any reason to seek out feminist groups or look for feminist ideology or suppose myself to be oppressed in a way that would cause me to need feminist fellowship. I've always been taught to just do and be. Another reason why I never saw myself as a feminist is that it's just not in my nature. I don't identify with the victim narrative that was always presented. I don't feel oppressed because I'm female. I don't think there's some societal conspiracy to keep me down. It just doesn't compute with me. The evidence isn't there. In addition, I don't have it in me to be constantly afraid and to be constantly intimidated. If I did, I wouldn't have survived my childhood illness. And while my childhood illness was manageable, it wasn't as bad as some that I've seen, it did teach me that I have to have some agency in order to get through life. And it was something that once I started to become aware of what feminism was and learn a little bit about feminist thought, it just made me incompatible with it. I guess that's why when I finally started encountering feminists and feminist writing and feminist academics and so on, their promulgations didn't really have the intended effects on me. All feminists showed me of feminism during my youth was feminists hating on men and boys. Their advocacy and their stated beliefs were in direct contradiction to all of the evidence that I had seen in my life from the men and boys around me. This is not to say that I had not seen men and boys behaving dysfunctionally, but that it was obvious that their behavior was not a feature of their gender. I learned strictly from feminist behavior, nowhere else but feminist behavior, that feminism is fundamentally based on hating men and boys. And if you want an example, one of the first things I ever heard from a self-professed feminist was that abortion was necessary because dads are deadbeats. She didn't give me any arguments about bodily autonomy. She didn't even give me any arguments about medicine or science, any attempts to persuade me to believe that fetal bodies are just tissue. Just fathers are deadbeats. That it wasn't something that I could look at and say, well, this is a sensible argument. It was just vitriol. And that's been my experience with feminists from the get-go. Even feminists that present themselves as moderates. If you scratch the surface, if you talk to them long enough, you eventually get to the point where they will treat compassion for men and boys as an attack on women. And they will treat men and boys as the at-fault party for anything that goes wrong in the lives of women and girls. I was never conditioned to buy into an ideology like that. So I never did. Then when I hit the age at which most girls get sucked into the feminist narrative, the college years, the feminists around me and the feminists that were making news media were using a blatantly and obviously false narrative on sexual violence. And again, indiscriminate and generalized demonization of men to promote discriminatory law and policy at the federal level. In other words, they were lying about campus rape to promote the Violence Against Women Act. And that was all over the news at the time. And I was reading about it. I read about various criticisms of the research, so-called research, that was being used to promote that law. I read the debates. I talked to feminists, I talked to non-feminists, and I looked at my own experiences. And I realized that feminism was bullshit that was based on bullshit. And I never really got sucked into it. Oh, I got sort of dragged along for a little bit. Not so much in terms of actually advocating feminism and agreeing with things feminists said, but there were feminists around me that tried to use my life as an example of why feminism was needed. It didn't work out too well. And, I came out of it. I came out of university experiences and interacting with feminists and interacting with the world around me, looking at my life, looking at the research, looking at everything that pretty much contributed to the discussion, with the attitude that this really wasn't something I needed. And that was where I was left. At that point, I really didn't have anything to say in the conversation other than that I'm not a feminist. Now, there was more to the story, and I'll tell more to the story, but that's for the next video, why I'm an anti-feminist. So this is it for this video, and I'll continue on in the next one.